Hello, everyone. In this podcast, we will be discussing sensitive topics such as sexual assault. It's important to take care of yourself while listening. Some suggestions are listening while you're in a healthy headspace or knowing who you can reach out to if you become upset. Our 24/7 helpline for crisis calls based out of Central Florida is 407-500-HEAL. By contacting the national hotline at 1-800-656-4673, you can get support and learn about your local resources. There's always someone ready to help. Welcome to the Victim Service Center podcast. Here we sit down with professionals that serve survivors and victims of trauma or those who've experienced violence and have conversations about social issues. This week, we are talking about toxic positivity. My name is Emilie Mitchell. My pronouns are she, her, and I am the education coordinator at the Victim Service Center of Central Florida. With me today have returning Dr. Kimberly Spence. Dr. Spence uses she, her pronouns and has served as the coordinator of educational and training programs for the Center for Autism and Related Disabilities, or CARD, at the University of Central Florida since 1999, and as the clinical director of Autism Support Services for Specialized Treatment and Assessment Resources, which is a private forensic practice since 2017. She has lectured nationally and internationally regarding treatment, specialized therapeutic intervention, and the creation of specialized sexuality education programs for individuals with autism spectrum disorders, or ASD, for over 20 years. So Dr. Spence, thank you so much for being on the podcast once again.
Thank you, Emilie. It's a pleasure to be here.
And I also have returning Jocelyn Rayas. Jocelyn uses she, her pronouns and is a bilingual crisis counselor / victim advocate at the VSC. Jocelyn obtained her bachelor's degree in criminal justice and her master's in human services. She recently moved down to Florida over a year ago and is a huge animal lover. So Jocelyn, thank you for coming back onto the podcast as well.
Thank you for having me again.
I'm really excited to have this conversation. I think it's one that, you know, as I was researching about it, I was starting to become more and more aware of this issue of toxic positivity. And I think that it's such an important topic to discuss. So this week, we're talking about toxic statements that well-intentioned people may be saying to the survivors in their lives, the effects toxic positivity and suppressing emotions can have on individuals, and how we can reframe these statements into validating and supportive ones. So with that, as always, I like to start off with definitions. So how would you define toxic positivity?
I can go first. My definition, just to be short and concise, of toxic positivity is not allowing yourself or others around you to truly express or process any sort of what I'm going to refer to through this podcast as negative emotions, because there's this belief right now that we need to always look on the bright side of things or surround ourselves with positive energy just 24/7.
Absolutely. I think that's a great definition. Do you want to add anything to it, Dr. Spence?
I'm going to come from the lens of somebody who has spent my entire career supporting people who have disabling conditions. So not only people with disabling conditions, but the families, the communities, and the support networks. And from my perspective, I definitely feel like there is a pretty significant problem with people wanting things to be different or better. So maybe not wanting their kids to have a disability or wanting their life, and you know, for lots of different reasons. And I also feel in general, most of us, and in full disclosure, myself personally, there's times things are just difficult. Friends who are battling cancer, or the loss of a loved one, or things that happen that are normal things in life to your friends or your family, and in general, just having a difficult time relating to others about it. And I know I've been taught certain things to say. Some of that may be based on my gender and my age, but things like, "Oh, I'm so sorry," or things like, "Oh, it's going to get better." And I know we're going to talk more about this, but in the lens of disability, I think people often just don't know what to say. They don't know what to say to family members. They don't know what to say to people, to an individual themselves. So I think it's just really laden. Which is not a great definition, but just my perspective on this topic in particular.
No, absolutely. I really appreciate you both breaking it down, and I appreciate that lens too, Dr. Spence. It's one that I haven't really thought of before. I think that there can be a sense of shame if we have negative feelings regarding being in that kind of community, instead of just always making themselves have to feel a certain way. I think, and we'll be talking a little bit about, suppressing emotions and things like that. But with that, I'd like to open it up, what are some other examples of toxic positivity? So for example, what are some statements that people say to others or to themselves, that kind of thing?
I know Dr. Spence already used some examples of some statements, but other popular statements that I hear a lot, or I myself may find myself saying as well, is, look on the bright side of things. Don't be such a negative Nancy. Don't worry, be happy, etc.
Absolutely. Yeah, those are really easy ones that come to mind. And I'm pretty sure I've said those multiple times to people.
I think those are fantastic examples. And I will tell you, the one that I've been consciously really trying to focus on over the last several months, actually, and the one that I hear a lot, and I hear this from family members, I hear this from individuals who have a disability who have been victims, is, "I don't have it that bad." There are people, and whether it's relating to the disability in general or the victimization, whatever may have happened, so many people have it so far worse. And a lot of us, I think, are just super uncomfortable with just expressing or admitting to others that it feels terrible and you're afraid. And I think there's this perception, and I know I've certainly been guilty of this myself, this perception of, not even allowing yourself to have any feelings about things. And for different reasons, I have said that over time, and I've really been trying to kind of watch it, both with myself, with the clients that I support, with my own family members. I mean, and I think it comes from a place of being well-intentioned, or, maybe wanting to try to help somebody, with perspective. But that's what I'm working on personally.
I think it's one that we can all relate to, Dr. Spence, definitely. And we'll talk a little bit more of like why we think people do this. I think you hit the nail on the head there. And also we're conditioned to do it. So it's not, we have to kind of re-socialize ourselves. So it's kind of an ongoing thing. Just like rape culture is something that, we didn't create, but we're part of, and we're just kind of working on that. You talked about victims, and I also wanted to ask specifically, what are some statements that people can say specifically to survivors of trauma that are these toxic positivity kind of statements?
Again, a lot of the common statements that I hear either other individuals say to survivors of trauma, or survivors of trauma themselves say to, them, is, "It could have been so much worse. I could have, died, or they could have killed me," or I hear, "I'll get over it soon," or "You'll get over it soon. Everything will work out in the end for you." Those are the most common that come to mind that I hear.
I think just to touch on what Jocelyn said, and some of this I think is just prevalent in the disability community. So whether you're a person who's providing a service, or you're an advocate, or but I think there's this difficulty with what to do and how to respond, and so by that I mean, do I say to someone with autism, you're someone with autism, or you're autistic? And even at the most basic level, there's been a lot of, script flipping in the last year and a half, 2 years so I think there's people that are trying to be sensitive when they're working with someone who's been victimized, regardless of what situation occurred. And I think the additional layer in the disability community, we're kind of already struggling with that anyway. And then we add this other layer that we're not really sure how to handle sometimes, whether I'm a family member, I'm a provider. So this idea about, it's going to get better, and this idea about it could have, I just feel like it helps people feel better. It could be worse, it could have been this, it could have been, and I hear that so often. And to take it another step, I hear family members, because I'm on a lot of forums where families support each other, and they communicate this, it's going to get better, it'll be, and there's not really a response of, oh my goodness, that really must feel awful, or that must, kind of acknowledging how the person feels.
Right. It sounds like no one, it's not sitting with the person and meeting them where they're at. It's almost like, kind of, here, let's move forward, and this is how we can do it in that sense, but not actually allowing that person to have the space to process the emotion, to go through it. So statements like, it's going to be okay, we're going to get through this. Maybe even for survivors, it's like, oh, well, things happen for a reason. And that could be a really toxic statement, but it could also be like, oh, this will make you stronger, or this made, that kind of thing, instead of, actually acknowledging what someone is feeling. I wanted to see if there were any other signs of toxic positivity, maybe not just statements. So for example, if someone's just hiding or masking their feelings, or shaming those who are not being positive, anything like that you want to touch on?
I think it's exactly what you just touched base on, Emilie. We tend to hide our true feelings, maybe because we feel guilty or ashamed of them. We don't want to burden others. And just going back to statements, what Dr. Spence mentioned earlier, I too find myself guilty of diminishing a bad day or negative experience that I may have, just by telling myself, Jocelyn, you don't gain anything from having a bad mood, or stop being so dramatic. You need to be grateful because there are others who are going through worse things. So not allowing myself to fully process a bad day or negative emotions, because I feel like, oh, if I do that, then I might cause, a friend or family member or my partner to have a bad day as well.
I was just thinking about, about this, the idea and the impact of shame. And when I think about a lot of the people who I've worked with who have various disabling conditions, so across a continuum, and I don't know, and I don't feel like it's fair or reasonable to say people without disabilities feel more or less shame, or their families. But I feel, to go back to my lens, is I feel like families, when these things happen, it's so incredibly stigmatizing. And I'm sure it is to everyone, but many parents who have kids with disabilities already feel this tremendous sense of guilt, and I need to overfunction, and I need to make it right, and I need to take care. And then when an individual is victimized, male or female, and whatever the specific circumstance, I feel like it's even more kind of heaping into the pile, if that makes any sense. and they've had a lot of practice, I can do it. And, kind of running with the sword to help their kid, or from my perspective, as supporting a client, and to my own detriment or to their own detriment, and I think some of that does have to do, there's a shame component in there. It's, you're perceived as less than by others if you're saying or speaking your truth, because that's not how you're supposed to act. I'm making air quotes. I know we're on a podcast, but that's not how you're supposed to act. And I feel like that's really damaging. And it just sets people up to be in a very difficult, untenable position.
Absolutely. And I appreciate you bringing in kind of intersectionality here of victims who also have a disability. That's really important. And I can definitely see how they can compound, as you were saying, these effects, and also why the snowballing, I suppose, of toxic positivity can really just kind of go haywire, really. And speaking of which, what are the effects of toxic positivity? I know that there was actually a study, and if you don't mind, I might just say it really quickly, this particular study. So they did this study, the psychological study, to see about cortisol levels, and cortisol is the stress hormone. And essentially what they did was they had two groups of people. One, they were both watching a very stressful thing, right? Something that was really stressful and heightened cortisol levels. But they told one group to suppress their emotions and not show any. And they told the other group, just watch this and go through the motions. And they actually found that those who suppressed their emotions and were told to do so actually had higher levels of cortisol. So I wanted to kind of touch on this a little bit, of what are the effects of suppressing your emotions and actually not allowing yourself that space.
There are a few effects of toxic positivity. I think one of them that I'll touch on is isolation, and then I would want to sort of dive into the effects of toxic positivity on, survivors of sexual violence in particular. But one of the effects in general is isolation. I sort of touched base on this on my own personal life, where I don't want to share, any bad days or any bad emotions that I may be experiencing with others. I kind of isolate those feelings and I keep them to myself. But people tend to isolate themselves from others, especially, if they have already tried to express their emotions to someone who essentially minimize those emotions, whether they realize it or not, because they may feel that no one wants to be bothered or surrounded by negativity. And they can also isolate themselves because society has essentially taught us, no one likes being around a negative Nancy or a Debbie Downer. But other effects, which, is interesting to me as I was doing research on this topic, are shame, suppressed emotions, isolation. And I found this interesting because when I respond to a case, or when I'm on scene with a survivor of a sexual assault, I take the time to inform them of common emotions that they may experience, which were those same emotions. It was shame, it was suppressed emotions, it was isolation, etc. And thinking about it more and diving into it, I feel as though the effects are the same with toxic positivity and common reactions that survivors of sexual assault may experience, because, the survivors themselves may not be in a place where they are ready to dive into those emotions or dive into that trauma that they just endured. So they're closing themselves off from experiencing and expressing, again, as Dr. Spence said, we're using air quotations, but you can't see as those negative emotions.
I think that's really interesting, the way that you framed that, Jocelyn, because we know that harboring things like sexual violence and other victimizations have, on the long term, mental health effects, but also like physical health effects too. And it makes sense that not being able to process emotions and have that space can have similar effects. We also know from research that, isn't it about on average 7 years before someone actually seeks help after a victimization or something like that?
I believe so. And sometimes we even see, it being more, just being present within our main office in Orlando. We have, individuals who are calling that want to set up an appointment to process trauma that they've experienced 10, 15, 20 plus years ago.
Yeah, so I can see how toxic positivity can kind of play into this a little bit of, not allowing people to have the space to actually be and feel negatively sometimes. And also, if we are within the people in our lives kind of saying these things and not meaning to do it, are we really able to tell them, hey, have this space. If something happens to you, you can, I'm a safe person to talk to about this. They might kind of be a little too afraid to bring it up, maybe because they've been conditioned, and also they've been told to like, hey, kind of brush that aside. And so I can see actually how this could silence people in multiple different ways. And I don't know if you had anything that you wanted to add on that with Dr. Spence.
I'm Rolodexing in my head and thinking about people that I have known and individuals I've supported. And I was thinking back to a particular instance with a young woman who at the time was 20, and she was raped. And it was pretty well documented what happened, and several people knew about what happened for a lot of reasons. And in following along with support to the family, her mother really had a bad time with it. And her mother, so single mother doing the best she could. So she felt very bad about the situation. She felt a lot of guilt, which, it was obviously not her fault, had nothing to do, with anything wrong that mom did, but just culturally speaking, for this young woman, there was a lot of negativity surrounding, what had happened, and now that she was less than as a person. And it was just, there were so many different things. And I think about, in that instance, I remember really clearly sitting in, this was back before the pandemic, in the days when, we did home visits, and I was in the home with clients, and that was part of how we supported them. And I remember her mom about maybe 6 months post incident, and, we're working through everything. And I remember her mom, every time the young lady would want to talk about it, which was pretty frequent. And, and I completely I can understand it was really upsetting to her. But her mom looked at me and said, "You've got to make her stop perseverating about this," and so perseveration is a term that we in the autism community are pretty familiar with. And the implication or how I interpreted what mom said to me was that this is an autism-y thing, like make this go away. And I kind of had to tried very gently to say, she's traumatized. I mean, this is, maybe part of this is she's saying the same things over and over again, but she is traumatized, and she's going to have an outlet to let things out of her, to express herself, and there needs to be a safe zone around her. So we need to, as part of the treatment recommendations, come up with a way that, your own issues related to this do not supersede her need to seek support or express her, it felt terrible, and she was very upset about it, and it was just a very difficult. And I was just thinking about that when Jocelyn was speaking.
Thank you, Dr. Spence. Thank you. I really appreciate you sharing that story. And just for people, because I actually have never heard of that term, perseverating. So could you actually just define it really quickly?
So as part of having autism, one of the characteristics of autism will be that people get onto a topic or a quote or an item, and they will want to see it over and over and over, or they'll say it over and over and so perseveration means a repeated behavior where they, maybe they do a movement in some way, but most often it's linked to, I'm very highly fixated on a character in a movie or a comic or anime or something like that, or they will say something using echolele or delayed echolele. They'll just repeat it over, and many families say, oh my goodness, this is so challenging, because they'll literally in a span of 2 hours hear something thousands of times. So part of, I think, what was going on was mom was equating the young woman's talking about that to she's perseverating, which is something that happens in the world of autism. But in my, being there and giving her feedback was, she's not perseverating about what happened. She's truly upset about what happened. And she's expressing that she feels violated, and that, she was expressing how her body felt. And I think she needed to go through what she needed to go through. And so, we were able to talk through that, but it was, there are things that are related to having different kinds of disabilities where I think it might be more challenging for families, care providers, treatment providers to go write it off or write something off and say, this is more, the etiology is about the disability versus this person has been traumatized. They're a victim, and they're expressing themselves in the best way they can.
I really appreciate your perspective on this, Dr. Spence. It really is shedding more light onto this topic. And again, intersectionality is so important. And for us to understand the individuality of this and how everyone's different, and understanding that from that perspective is so important to help support everyone in our lives. So I really appreciate you sharing that story. It's fascinating. And I hope that they were able to kind of process and go through that. I also wanted to talk about, I think some people may think they are spreading positivity rather than suppressing emotions, because, we talk about how like we're kind of trained to do this, conditioned to do this, I should say, and people think that they might be uplifting someone instead of actually letting someone process. So what is the difference between things like gratitude? We talked a little bit about that, and toxic positivity. When does it become toxic?
The best way that I think I can explain the difference is when we practice gratitude, or when I practice gratitude with my clients, is I like to emphasize that we're able to practice that because we are acknowledging the pain, the distress, the suffering that we went through in order to go through this healing process, and in order to get to the goal that we set, that we wanted to achieve. And the difference between that and toxic positivity is, as we mentioned, with toxic positivity, you don't allow yourself to feel any pain, to feel any distress, any negativity at all. So in my personal life, like just a quick example that I can think of that is basic, but it makes the point, is that for me, like I'm grateful and I express gratitude that I, obtained both a bachelor's and a master's degree, because I, till this day, can vividly remember just all the stress with juggling multiple part-time, full-time jobs, full-time student, sleepless nights, breakdowns of just crying and feeling like I can't do it, I'm going to give up. But I got myself through those programs. So I acknowledge the pain that got me through to the goal that I wanted to achieve.
I love that example. We were using the word shame earlier. I didn't hear that at all. I heard like pride, like you were proud of it. And those are kind of like opposite feelings, right? So I love that example. Is this ever, a difficult balance as a counselor, how we can support people and validate their emotions without having them get stuck, so to speak? I know that there's like this idea of rumination, for example. So is that ever kind of a difficult balance of validating someone's emotions and also at the same time not allowing, well, encouraging them to not ruminate on negative emotions. And again, air quotes here.
I find this question interesting in my own personal life because as a counselor and speaking on a counselor perspective, at least with my clients, I don't find it to be difficult because I make myself aware that this is probably like the first time that they will be able to be in an environment where they can just truly express everything that they are feeling, that they are experiencing. And I know it takes time to get there. I have to provide a safe space. I have to kind of work with them and letting them know that we are going on their time whenever they are ready. Letting them know that we're human and it's normal to not always be perfect. And also, you know, practicing active listening, validating, and in a sense, kind of challenging them as well, because they would still want to practice that suppressing and keeping things, you know, to themselves, even though they have already made progress with you. And, you know, I know we touched about this when we were discussing ideas about this podcast. And, you know, I mentioned to you, Emilie, and that when it comes to doing counseling sessions with my clients, like the first couple of sessions, you know, when I noticed that they refer to their sexual assault as, you know, an incident or the thing that occurred, or, you know, the first couple of sessions, I let it slide, but I, in a sense, repeat what they are saying to me, you know, just to understand. You want to essentially, you know, get to a point where you're comfortable of speaking about your sexual assault. So I physically say it. And throughout the sessions, they become comfortable saying it as well. But in my own personal life, for whatever reason, as Dr. Spence said as well, we tend to practice and are culprits of toxic positivity. So it's, while I can work with my clients on bringing them to, you know, gratitude and genuine optimism, to myself doing research on this podcast, I'm like, wow, why do I myself not practice this? And instead I find myself practicing toxic positivity in my own personal life.
I just love the whole dialogue that we're having, but I was thinking, as Jocelyn was speaking about, I feel like personally and professionally, which are obviously two different things, you know, because we have our personal lives and we have our whatever our work hat is, that to me, where does it go from sort of a good space to being negative, you know, and where's that? And I feel like when people are not feeling heard, and whatever, and that obviously, I feel like that means different things to different people. And when you have become the victim of a violent sexual assault, of any kind, and you're not able to be heard, you know, so the words you're using or the way you're saying it may not be how everyone else understands it, but you want to be heard in some way. And I feel like when that starts to degrade, there becomes a problem. So whether it's the example that I just gave, which is the mom felt like she was being perseverative or she was obsessing over, you know, so it was less content and more ritual and doing something. So the young lady wasn't feeling heard and she became more emphatic, you know, she started getting visibly upset, and I was trying to kind of think of the sequence of that. And I feel like when people are not being heard, I think either they may get upset or they may get angry, and then they just retreat, you know, and depending on who they're interacting with. So I feel like it's this balance of having, you know, and Jocelyn's just talking about, you know, and I've thought of working with many clients where I have to kind of shut some things down. You know, I have to say, okay, we're not going to talk about this topic because it's not related to whatever happened. But then, you know, it's kind of this slippery slope of like also allowing them to feel how they feel. And I feel like it's there. I feel like both those components are necessary to take someone and help someone through this process of, this is what happened, this terrible thing happened, and labeling it, but hearing people in the way they need to be heard, labeling it, and then, letting them feel that way. And then I think comes more, the more end game of, psychoeducational or therapeutic intervention, which is, here's what I'm going to do, cognitive behavioral therapy. Here's what I'm going to do instead. Here's what I'm going to do when I have these thoughts. But I feel like those have to be present. And I think it's so difficult because if, Emilie, if I'm talking to you about what things make you feel heard and validated, or Jocelyn, or for me, or if I talk in my personal life to my partner, there's things that for my partner will make my partner feel heard. And I've, spent a lot of time understanding that, obviously. And so when we deal with a client, it's very difficult, to get to quickly know that establish therapeutic rapport. And as we're talking about it, when we were getting ready for this, I was thinking it was a clear channel, but as we're talking, I'm thinking, wow, this feels like, going over Niagara Falls, it's just.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, everything that you're saying about, like, there are times where, first of all, I appreciate you kind of bringing up, like, okay, so this isn't the topic that we're talking about. We're talking about this particular thing, because rumination definitely you start thinking of all negative things. And that's just how the human brain works. When you think of a negative situation, our brain is accessing a part of memory where we think of other negative stuff. So obviously we don't want to spiral, right? But we also want to validate at the same time. So I appreciate kind of the complicated nature of this, but this idea that you brought up of, if when the person isn't being heard or feels like they're not being heard, that's where it kind of crosses that line. And I also appreciate you acknowledging the individuality of what that can look like. And I think that that's something that we can learn about ourselves and also our relationships too, right? And it can be changing, there's different times when we feel heard and when we don't feel heard, right?
I was just going to say to that end too, if I'm interacting with someone who's male or female, or I'm interacting with someone who's 20 versus someone who's 60, I feel like there's all these other complexities that come to it based on your gender, your sexual identification, and your age. I mean, I'm a 53-year-old woman, so I have generationally some perspectives about things that 30-year-olds, 20-year-olds, and some of this is socially influenced, some of this is by my family of origin, but the complexity in each individual case, I work with a lot of people with autism, but I have to treat every person in what they need, what is their pathway. And that's also with these other variables coming into play. And in the disability community, there's, we want to cookie cut a lot of people. There's some good people out there too, but I feel like there's this, we want a cookie cutter. And so all people with autism, this is what you do. I mean, if you're a victim advocate and the client has autism, do this. And we can't one approach certain, as I know Jocelyn, I know we talked about this when we were prepping, and we can't one approach anybody, regardless if it's a male, a female, a person who's transgender, whatever the case may be, it's so individual, and where they're at, and when Jocelyn was speaking, kind of where they are, and regardless of time span, where they are at.
I'd like to really come back to why we do these things. Why do we practice this? So why do you think that we do practice things like toxic positivity? And why do you think we say toxic positive statements to ourselves and others?
I know I mentioned it earlier before, but in a sense, I just feel like it's what we have been taught by society, or what society has normalized. And, I mentioned before when we were planning this, it comes down to, many of the times it was, well, you have to be grateful for what you have because there are other children out there, or other families who are struggling to get by, who don't have a roof over their head. And then now, especially with, all the younger kids out there having access to phones, to tablets, to social media, it comes down to, social media influence as well of displaying a perfect life.
Yeah, not wanting to, just sharing. We're able to kind of line veto our life, for lack of better term, kind of this idea of we can put out there what we feel most comfortable putting out there, and what people most of what I'm seeing is putting out the positive vibes and the positive things out there instead of the negative parts to it. And then, what do you think the effects are, now that we're kind of going on this route? What do you think the effects are for people who see that on social media, see their friends only the positive stuff?
This is, I feel, such a big issue, and I know one that we've, between ourselves, have discussed. And I feel both personally and professionally that when you're seeing things in social media, obviously, we're all educated folks, and we know that social media is largely not true. I mean, it's filters and light and perspective, and somebody who's been willing to take 8,000 pictures to get one good one. And to go back to kind of why we do things, I think people in general want to project their best self. They want to, they want everyone around them. And I think this is a normal, I would like my friends and family to think I'm a good person. I'd like to think I'm a good person. And, some of that when we're posting and we're doing those things is motivated by that. And, we were joking earlier, I don't see people posting up, I made a terrible choice today, or I see people posting up, they're eating in a nice place, or they got a nice outfit, or they got an accolade, or they got a promotion, or they got, the good stuff. And sometimes I see people, medical issue or problem, but I have never in my life, not that I spend tons of time trolling social media, I have never seen anyone put up, I was raped and this is what I did about it, or a family member or another person who's in a therapeutic alliance to say, this thing happened and this is what's going on. And I think it's so stigmatized. And I think in general, I can only speak for myself, but sometimes I think people just really don't know what to say and truly want to help and truly feel terrible, but they really don't know what to say. And kind of, if everyone else out there in, Instagram land or Twitter sphere or whatever, all those, again, obviously I'm 53, so I don't even know everything that's out there, is out there making people look this false perfectionist, false perfect life. And you think, well, I'm the only one, and it's to go back to shame. I think people just feel this sense of shame as if I'm not good enough. I don't look right. I don't act right. I don't, and I think it's really debilitating, and now with the pandemic and we're in these little silos, and if all you're doing is looking at, somebody went out and took a beautiful picture of a blade of grass. Oh, I'm somehow not as good because I did, and it's like that person was bored out of their mind and nobody's working because it's the pandemic. And
I also want to touch base on the social media aspect. As Dr. Spence said, we, focus on only sharing the good part of our lives and not the bad parts. And it comes from, shame and from guilt. But, thinking about what Dr. Spence was saying, there's that other aspect of, people don't want to be vulnerable and share on social media, because then it comes down to, comments that I hear people say multiple times, oh, why are they sharing this? That's personal. They need to keep that to themselves. Or, they're just doing this to draw attention to themselves. They're seeking attention. Or, in general, obviously we've seen it when Mother's Day, Father's Day rolls around, birthdays, they make this huge post, and it's well, what's the point of that if their mom or their dad isn't even on social media? They won't be able to see that. They should just keep it to themselves. So, we are very contradicting on what we expect from social media and what we want to see on social media.
That is such a good point, Jocelyn. And another thing that I was thinking of while we were talking about like why we think we practice toxic positivity, and talking about just in general how we want to put our face forward, the best of us, right? I think definitely there's this idea of cognitive dissonance, right? This idea of that we don't, well, I want to be seen as a good person, right? Or I have the perfect life, and things like that. But the truth is we're complicated, and everyone is, and it kind of just is uncomfortable to think that the person that seems to have a perfect life sometimes makes bad choices, but that's quote unquote bad choices, I should say. But that's how it is. And so kind of being able to just sit with the uncomfortableness, I think, is so important as we talk about this, because that sense of shame is just silencing so many people. Do you think there's a generational gap here too, as in regards to social media, that you want to touch on? Kind of commenting on the generational gap in terms of if there is one with toxic positivity, and if you think that there's things are changing with new generations or things like that.
Yeah. Again, going back and referencing the meeting that, we did to plan this podcast and this topic, I want Dr. Spence to talk a little bit more about the example she gave, but what she said really stuck with me, that, older generations had this toughen up attitude. Life is never easy. You got to roll with the punches. So I feel like with older generations, and I've seen it like with my older clients as well, it's hard to break that barrier, because what they learned is don't talk about it, like keep it to yourself. So it's making them, realize that it's okay to speak about these things. It's normal. And with generations now, I feel as though it's now normalized to speak on what you find offensive, to what you don't, like, but kind of keep it positive. So it's very different, but at the end of the day, you can see that it's still focused on don't share the negative, only keep to the positive. And as Dr. Spence touched too, you have to be aware of, sexual orientation, of their cultural background, because, my parents are Mexican, and going into the Hispanic community with my other colleagues who are bilingual advocates, our struggle right now is also working with the Hispanic community to make them realize, in our culture, mental illness doesn't exist. You're making it up. So it's having people realize that no, mental health is a thing. It's important. It's normal. So there's just a lot of different, I guess, generational and cultural and different demographic gaps and struggles and obstacles.
That's such a good point. I literally just got goosebumps, Jocelyn, when you were talking about going into, being someone of Mexican descent and Hispanic culture in general. And this is not to lob anything negative. I did a presentation this morning, and one of the topics is talking about diagnosis and people with having autism or mental health. And there were 4 studies we were citing as part of this presentation. And culturally speaking, I'll just give a snippet of when there are 2 studies in particular that I reviewed that compared people, moms who are Black, moms who are Hispanic, and moms who are white. And when they received a diagnosis of autism or some other difficulty with their child. And so the moms who were white were kind of like, oh, fantastic, let's go get services. Moms who were Black responded, I've been asking for help for 2 or 3 years. No one listened to me. And they were angry. Hispanic moms were immediately guilty, immediately panicked, immediately felt stigmatized. And I think it's so interesting when you think about that in context. And so the cultural piece, I feel, is super important, but also to kind of circle back to the generational. So if I, myself, and I've disclosed that I'm an ancient fossil, and, in comparison to Gen Zers, I have family members in my immediate, I've some babies, and they're 20 and they're 21 and 22. And the way they perceive discussing things that are difficult or uncomfortable is so different than the way I was taught. And my family of origin, I think they're pretty fantastic. I love them. And I don't think it's that they were trying to do me a disservice, but I was taught, you keep it together. You put on your best face, you don't complain. And I'll give an example, rub some dirt in it. You keep on going. You do not need to sit back and feel sorry for yourself. And that, I don't think, was because they're bad people. I think that was, in my parents' generation, that was just how you did it. And I think as a woman, there's another layer to that, where there's a little more pressure to keep it together. And, I just think it's really complex.
I do too. And the more we're talking about it, the more things are like running through my mind as I'm, processing this too and relating it to my own life. And there was something that you kind of touched on, Jocelyn, about how, yeah, so obviously there's this generational gap, but I think you're right about how younger people are still trying to bring awareness to maybe negative things, but in a positive way. And I hear a lot of people, like my peers, say things like, well, I want to spread positivity. I want to be the positive person on the internet because the internet's so negative, and Reddit and all this stuff. And I just kind of wanted to shift gears a little bit and put that into the context of COVID, because COVID is such a stressful time. And I wanted to ask kind of, do you think there is like this toxic positivity in regards to coping with COVID? This idea that we're all kind of going through this at the same time. We shouldn't be, always, sitting with the disappointments of this, and it's a lot longer than people thought it would be, that kind of thing. So do you have any comments about toxic positivity in that kind of context?
Honestly, what comes to mind that I myself have, said to myself is just, again, going back to, well, yeah, it sucks that I haven't been able to travel or take any vacations, or that, I had to adapt work-wise to our new protocol. And I validate that with, well, I should be lucky because at least I haven't, experienced COVID, or I haven't fallen victim to COVID. There are other people who have, been positive, who have gotten COVID, who ended up in the hospital, who died, friends whose family members passed away because of COVID. So to me, it's, oh yes, we're, enclosed in our house, can't really travel, but at least I haven't experienced COVID. Like, I've been healthy.
I think what I was thinking in my head, and I feel like there's been kind of stages of COVID. So I feel like in the beginning, there was a lot of denial, just everyone, all of us, right? Because nobody wanted to believe that this terrible thing is happening. And for people, I travel for my job, and I'm used to interacting with people, and by nature of what I do, it's obviously very challenging to do many of the things I do electronically. I mean, we've all had to kind of figure it out. But I feel like in the beginning, there was sort of this, it was kind of acceptable and encouraged, was everyone to go, oh, this is, a bunch of hooey, or this is this, or, kind of joke about it. And I think that was sort of a collective, nobody really wanted to believe this is going to be around for a while, and this sucks, and it's going to suck. And I think so and then we got into lockdown phase, and then people started being affected by financially affected, personally affected. I have friends that lost parents. I know plenty of people that had COVID and got very sick. So then I feel like there was sort of a phase where it became sort of catastrophic response. And I saw both sides of responding to that. I saw people attacked because they were speaking their truth or talking about it, or I saw people, minimizing it, minimizing what was happening. And I feel like, coming up into the fall, just from my perspective, it seems people seem a little more willing to acknowledge what's actually happening. But by this time, it's been going on nearly a year. And I think it's just, to me, it strikes me as interesting that normal human behavior is when things are difficult, we want to go, la, I'm covering my ears, la 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 la, it's not happening. And I think that's just a response we have to things, and tying kind of back to the topic. It's a response we have, and people do it in different ways. If I just pretend it's not happening, it goes away, sort of in my frontal lobe, and I'm going to put it over here, it's over here. And I feel like the way people have responded to COVID has been very similar to that, if that makes sense.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think it's such a good representation of toxic positivity, to be honest, of this idea of it is kind of human nature to set that negative whatever aside within ourselves and with other people too. And so with that, we talked a lot about, what that can look like. We also talked a lot about the effects that it can have on people. So with that, I wonder, what can we say instead? So can we give some examples of changing toxic positive statements into perhaps like affirmations?
Yeah. Thinking, about my role with VSC, one of my responsibilities is to answer the helpline during the week 24/7, and thinking about calls of individuals who call in a state of crisis, and I can hear that they are crying and they're apologizing for crying. They're trying to have themselves stop. So instead of me saying like, oh, don't cry, it's okay, I'm here to help you, I always take the approach of, you don't have to apologize to me. It's okay to cry. Let's take a few minutes to allow you to do that. I'm right here on the helpline. Once you feel like you are ready to begin to ground yourself again, let me know, and we'll start working on some coping skills. They let me know, okay, I'm ready. We do maybe some breathing exercises, and once they're like, okay, I'm ready to talk, they're able to do so. And then when people, share their stories with me about their trauma, instead of saying or go to like, everything's going to be okay, don't worry about it, things will work out, turning that into, thank you for sharing that with me. What is it that you are feeling right now, or that you need assistance with right now, that I can help you with? So just acknowledging, that their feelings are real, how they're feeling about it, what, that you're here to help, that it's okay to feel those negative emotions. And now how are we going to process that?
Wow. I'm feeling chills multiple times throughout this. I have to be honest. I feel like incredibly, just like hearing, you speak, Jocelyn, to be honest, if I called the helpline and you answered, and all of our advocates are rock stars, of course, I just wanted to validate and just say, or acknowledge rather, like I would feel very safe. And it feels healthy almost, this idea of like, don't apologize, take a minute, however long that is, and then sit with that. That just feels like a lot healthier than swallowing it and then trying to do a coping skill right away. I love that you talked about, that's okay. This is normal. Like, how validating would that be? I don't know if you had any examples, Dr. Spence, of changing toxic positive statements to affirmations or something like that you wanted to share.
I was just thinking, and again, for me, I'm Rolodexing with different people and situations, and was reflecting while Jocelyn was speaking. And one of the things that for me over the course of my career, I feel like I was always kind of trying to monitor myself, was to not insert myself, so whatever had happened, whether it was, somebody got beat up, whatever circumstance had occurred, or, we could put anything in there. And I feel like, I have to be cognizant of my own uncomfortableness and like kind of be in the zone, so I need to be in the zone. I need to be myself, regulated a bit. And so when someone is in distress, someone is angry, someone is hurt, whatever that is to me kind of, I focus on, and have tried to, on like slowing the clock down. So by that, I mean just me going, oh, so I want that person to know I'm hearing them. And I might not always, sort of understand what's happening, but always kind of trying to clarify by saying, really reflexive kinds of questions like, you sound like you are very upset right now, or it sounds like you are really hurting. And I love what Jocelyn said about sometimes, people need to cry, or sometimes people need to yell. I have interacted with people that just need to do what they need to do, and I need to stay calm and not react to that, not respond, not go, oh, you need to settle down, or you need to, which in disability community, knock it off, don't, we're not focusing on the right thing. And I think it's sort of, people are well intentioned, but hearing that person, so slowing down, feeling everything, and letting that person know. And I love how Jocelyn described it, let that person know whatever you're feeling is okay. And I'm not here, and in whatever way I need to say that to a client. And sometimes it's being quiet, sometimes it's holding their hand, sometimes it's letting them rock back and, whatever that is, but just hearing them and acknowledging it, and not putting a label on it. I feel like we want to make ourselves feel, we want to say, oh, like I'm the best therapist ever, I'm this or that. We want to label it and kind of show it to the person, and it's not necessary. It's not, and I really appreciate the dialogue we've been having, and Jocelyn saying, and I think this is so important, of the person is entitled to feel it and needs to feel it. So checking yourself, back in the day, we call that checking yourself at the door. You got to leave your, and people, I think, get into a mentality of like superhero, and I know many people, and they're really well intentioned and they're amazing therapists, but they're in that superhero, you can hear their cape flapping behind them, right? So it's not what this is about. It's not, at least as I understand it, it's supposed to be, it's not the best way to help people, in my opinion.
I love what you said about they're entitled to feel it. Absolutely. I love that statement. They're entitled and they should feel it and they need to feel it. So, what would you say to someone who is being affected by toxic positive statements from loved ones specifically? And then what would you say to someone who may be saying these statements to themselves? So I guess it's a two-part question. So how would you kind of support someone who is receiving these toxic positive statements from their loved ones? What would you say to them?
I think I like to answer this question both ways. If someone is receiving it from their loved ones, it takes time. It's never going to be easy, but you need to work, with that individual, in this sense, in my role, work with my client to build healthy boundaries. Letting them know if the support or the feedback that you're getting from a loved one or from a support system just doesn't seem to be helping you, make them aware of it. They may not be aware of it. Let them know, I know that maybe eventually I'm going to heal, but you can't just tell me to feel okay, or don't worry about it. Okay, just because you told me not to worry about it, it's no longer in my head. I'm fine, worry free. So, getting them to feel comfortable enough to, for lack of better words, call out that loved one that's only giving them positive, statements. And then also I work a lot with, the helpline, where I get calls from parents, from friends, from partners who are calling on behalf of, a survivor. And either they are expressing frustration because they feel as though, the survivor isn't taking the steps that they need to in order to heal. And it's exactly as Dr. Spence said, they are coming from a good spot because they have their superhero cap on and they really want to help this person because they care deeply for them. But it's making, them realize that we need to work on their time, that, yes, maybe counseling will help or a support group will help, but they can't force that survivor to do it. The survivor needs to come to the time where they realize that, they want the help and they want the, assistance, and reach out for themselves. Because especially focusing on sexual violence, they've had their power, in a sense, taken away from them. So if everyone else is doing everything for them around them, it's not a bad thing. But then again, they still don't have power to decide what they want to do now, in their healing process.
Yeah, I think that's a really important piece to this too, is the power and control, as we all know, and I've said it multiple times on this podcast, is that sexual violence and violence in general is kind of about this like power and control dynamic. And so when we aren't allowing people to feel their feelings, or we're not allowing them to take it in their own time of the healing journey, even if we are well intentioned, we are in a sense taking away that power again. And like Dr. Spence said, they're entitled to those feelings and they're entitled to their healing journey and what that timeline looks like. And so I love the statements of, I'm here. How can I help support you? And yeah, I think that those are wonderful, tips for people. I also like to acknowledge whenever I talk about boundaries, it's like a passion of mine. I love talking about boundaries. I love that. First off, I like to acknowledge that it takes practice to set boundaries. So don't feel bad if you, or feel however you'd like, I should say, but don't feel as if like all is lost if you're having a hard time setting boundaries. It does take a lot of practice, and it is also normal to feel guilty to set one. And I think that it has a lot to do with what we're talking about today, which is like the shame around it and those kinds of things. And at the same time, I like to kind of frame setting boundaries as communicating how someone can love you. This is how to best love me. And so I always like to highlight that. Yeah, I think that that's a great way to talk about this, is bringing up boundaries for sure. I don't know if you had anything you wanted to kind of talk about as far as what you would say to someone, Dr. Spence, who is either hearing these toxic positive statements from someone or maybe is saying it to themselves.
I have most often focused, and I love what you said about boundaries, Emilie. I love that. And I loved, and I have communicated this to many, many people, this idea that, when you set a boundary with people around you who have previously had poor boundaries, I can put on my, behavioral analysis cap, and there's just always this spike in the behavior, where then it's really super uncomfortable. And so then kind of we usually go back to the way it was versus pushing through that. And then the behavior kind of comes down a bit. But teaching people to say and to advocate for themselves and say, that makes me feel angry when you say keep, rub some dirt in it and move on. That makes me feel sad. That makes me feel less than. And so practicing with that person, if someone is saying something that's minimizing or is making a toxically positive comment about the circumstance because they're uncomfortable, because it doesn't matter. They don't know what to say, but grounding it in, let that person know how you feel and how it's affecting you. And that's a really, I think, is for all of us, we myself included, if we were all just bluntly, the minute anything happens, and we're human and we're terrible at this, most of us, but to say to someone, this is how this is making me feel, we'd probably have, better relationships, and it would be easier. And dealing with, physical trauma, sexual trauma would probably be a little easier to navigate if you could kind of just pull this up and say, that's what you're saying is triggering me, or it's making whatever that may be. And when related to the script in your head, or when people are kind of, back in the day, you say beating yourself up, you sound like you're really beating yourself up, or it sounds like you're taking a lot of responsibility here for something that happened that you had no, so almost kind of trying to help people with, how big is it really? And not that I'm putting my judgment on it, but to say, you're responding to, your perspective on it, to go back to the perspective piece, and maybe what they're responding isn't related to what happened. Maybe it's more how somebody says something, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, yeah, I do think it's important that we reframe when we talk to people about, this is how this is making me feel, and kind of doing those I statements. Absolutely. And I do appreciate what you said, where it's like, we talk about like, why do people do this? When we're setting boundaries, it kind of, like you mentioned, it doesn't matter what's important. If, if someone is setting a boundary with me, I just want to hear what, how are you feeling and what can I do? Right. That's what's really important. So if someone would like to learn more about toxic positivity, or need to get support or something like that, what are some resources that you'd like to suggest, or where can they start?
I would honestly just suggest everything that I personally did to research this topic for this podcast. Simple as, I went on YouTube, typed in toxic positivity podcasts. I found a TED Talk. So there's actually a lot of material on YouTube about this topic. And, even if you do a quick web search, you'll find a lot of articles and a lot of information as well. And then in terms of support, not to do a plug, but again, like, we have our 24/7 helpline. If someone, needs assistance on maybe getting comfortable with the fact of, how can I, let someone know that when they tell me, don't worry, or things will get better, or, you just keep on focusing on the same thing, like setting a healthy boundary, they can definitely call and reach a live advocate. And then there are other numerous amounts of emotional support helplines, both via phone and text. And, that can easily be accessed, whether it's a quick 211 call to inquire about that, or again, just giving us a call and we can connect you with those additional emotional support helplines.
Yeah, and I love that you brought up an example before, Jocelyn, about how supporters call sometimes too. And so I just want to say the hotline is for secondary survivors too, and those are the people who are the supporters of victims who have gone through trauma, or survivors who have gone through trauma too. So that helpline is really for anyone, honestly. I don't know if you had any resources you wanted to plug, Dr. Spence.
Well, I feel like what Jocelyn just recommended is fantastic. And in many areas, there are different avenues and conduits, but 211 is a fantastic way that in general is going to get you kind of down a route. So regardless of where you are geographically, because no matter where you're tuning in or you're hearing this, there are different resources. So if I think about across the state of Florida, or I think across the United States, there's just different spots where you find. So I think having the local, being able to contact and say, here's these 3 places you can call or check into. Obviously, you all are rock stars and everything you do is amazing. And I love, when I'm trying to learn about something, I feel like the internet is my friend, and I love Googling TED Talks. And I feel, I love that you made that suggestion, in that, they're often very motivational, but they're also people that are getting on doing TED Talks have done a lot of research. They're in general highly respected in my experience, and knowing people that have done TED Talks, they're highly respected in their field. They know their science, they know the research. They're not there to hype anything. They're there to help you learn, and in a concise, 10, 15 minutes or less. And who amongst us does not love to have it poured into our brain? So I think that's fantastic. And for me personally, and when we first started talking about this, I wrote down kind of the 4. I started thinking about, well, what are statements that I may make to my family members or to my clients? And so this it all happens for a reason. I feel like for a period of my life, that was a mantra somehow, and that was an acceptable mantra. So I think thinking about when things are bad for any of us, what's your mantra? What's your go-to? And I think it's important to kind of start with you, because I say to families all the time, I say to parents, you think about it like being on the airplane. You got to put the airbag on you first and you need to get it. And this is what I was talking earlier, which I may have not been clear about, and that dial it, and then think about your intervention with others, your support of others. But I feel, it's important to just be always learning. And for me, when we really started talking about this, I wrote them down and I was kind of tally tracking. And that one is one, I said it this week, and I said it came out, it jumped out of my mouth, and I thought, I'm doing exactly the thing we were gonna, and my motivation was, I have a friend who's going through a very difficult time, and we were kind of trying to process through it, and but I want to be part of reframing it and doing a better job of that. But I also have to think about it, for myself in my personal life and my professional life. So it's going to be okay. It all happens for a reason. This will make you stronger, and it could be worse. Those 4 I've been, and I have them on my pad here, and I've been, going around and talking, with the Gen Z people in my life and the older people in my life, about, and it, when you say it to people, they're like, oh gosh, I do that, but then it's like, you can't undo it, so I just feel like being really conscious about it. I think that's a resource, being conscious that that's a thing.
I love that. I love that you and kind of us all kind of realizing that we all do it and accepting that, and then maybe just saying, you know what, instead of saying that, can I say this instead and say, you know what, you're right. You absolutely are allowed to feel that right now. That's totally fine. What can I do to help? Or that really sucks. I'm so sorry that happened to you, or those kinds of things. I appreciate you kind of giving exact examples, because I think that really drives the point across, because it sounds like on the surface, it sounds like a very positive thing, but really it, like we were saying, it can make people feel small. It can make people feel like they have to swallow what they're feeling. And I think we do it to ourselves too. And so kind of give ourselves grace, and then give grace to those around us too. I think that's a wonderful place to sign off. But before we do, is there anything else that you would like to address that we may not have covered in relation to this topic?
I don't think so much addressed, but just reiterating what, Dr. Spence just said. I would just like to state for any listener out there who may have realized through this podcast that, they themselves practice toxic positivity, that I hope they don't feel bad, guilty, or ashamed about it, or feel like they're a horrible support system, because we're human. And as we stated, myself, you, Emilie, you, Dr. Spence, we ourselves practice it, and we're making ourselves aware of it as well. So, it takes time. It takes us being aware of, how we practice toxic positivity, and, little by little changing it into genuine optimism, into validating others' feelings, no matter what those feelings may be.
I think just to go back to, I think it's really important, and Emilie, you've alluded to it, to give yourself grace. And I think that many people just are not even aware that that's possible, and not because they're not smart people, and there's a lot of reasons for that, but just this idea that, give yourself a break. And a lot of, male or female, I think the things people say to themselves are always far worse, probably, than they hear from others. And I know many people that their internal dialogue and what is going on and what they're telling themselves that other people think or whatever, I mean, it's just, it's really overwhelming. And I think a lot of folks just don't realize that it's okay. It's okay to cry. It's okay to feel like I just can't do one more thing. I can't, engage with whatever that is. And I love when you say, give yourself grace. I think that's a really nice way of saying it.
Absolutely. And I think that that's a wonderful place to sign off. So thank you to the listener for listening to the Victim Service Center podcast. The VSC is a nonprofit organization that provides free, confidential counseling services for victims of any kind of trauma in Central Florida. To learn more about our services, please visit victimservicecenter.org. And to everyone listening, healing is not linear and you are not alone. And thank you so much, Dr. Spence and Jocelyn, for joining me today.
Thank you.
Glad to be here. It was a pleasure.